This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to my last Friday Late show of the year. I hope you've had a great week and you're looking forward to Friday night. Tonight, I'm looking at the biggest thing in education at the moment, which is Oracy. What is it? How does it impact teaching? Why is everyone suddenly talking about it? And to answer those questions, stay tuned for tonight's show. It's great to have you here.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live. Tune in live at ttradio.org, or to join in the conversation, download the Podbean app and search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TTRadio. Tune in, talk it out with Teachers Talk Radio.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Friday night. I hope you've had a good week and you're looking forward not too long to the Christmas break now. So tonight on this tonight's show, on July the 6th last year, Keir Starmer unveiled Labour's mission to break down barriers to opportunity at every stage in a speech delivered at Mid-Kent College, Gillingham. I'm not sure if people knew that happened. It's always interesting when these things come across. And in this speech, he said, let's take this on. Let's raise the importance of speaking skills, oracy, as academics call it, because these skills are absolutely critical for our children's future success. First and foremost, for academic attainment, talking through your ideas before putting them on the page improves writing, structured classroom discussion, deepens thinking. But it's not just a skill for learning, it's also a skill for life. I'm not going to try and impersonate the accent in any way. So ever since then, and this is July the 6th last year, ever since then, oracy seems to be one of the key things that people are discussing in education. But what exactly is it? What has Starmer's government actually done in promoting this idea? Is it really a key factor the Starmer believes it to be? And how can it really help our students? Is it just the latest fad in education, soon to pass by us like other trends that come and go? So tonight, I've got two fantastic guests to help me answer these questions and more, Gemma Molyneux and Matt Venton. So I can see that Matt's online at the moment, so I'm going to go to him first and then hopefully bring in Gemma a bit later when she connects. So hello, Matt, are you there?
Hello, how are you?
Yeah, not too bad. How are you?
I'm good. Friday evening, I'm awake, so that's an advantage.
That's always a good thing. So, would you just be able to introduce yourselves to the people listening out there?
Hi everyone. My name's Matt Benton. I'm a vice principal in a secondary school in a multi-academy trust in sort of southwest Surrey, and in that trust there are primary schools, there are special schools and secondary schools, but my specialism is secondary schools, and I'm currently sort of on secondment to one of the other secondary schools in the trust after having worked at my host school, my base school for 19 years. And I'm an English teacher still at the end of the day, and that's still what I really enjoy doing. But obviously, as a vice principal, responsible for lots of different things, I have an interest in oracy. Let's put it that way.
So, what would you say oracy is to you?
Oh God, that's a very good question. I think oracy is the ability to communicate verbally and hold the attention of your audience by various different going back to Aristotelian principles, your ethos, pathos, and logos, but at the same time also being able to connect and communicate with people in the room. And I think there is a real concern in the educational sector that secondary school children have become increasingly more passive in lessons and less actively engaged. And in a sense, classrooms have become quieter in the last few years.
So I can see Emma's here as well, so I'm going to bring her into the conversation. So it's very Oracy based. Hello, Gemma. Can you hear us? Sorry.
Yeah, sorry, I was doing that thing that happened the other day where I was clicking on it and it didn't work, so I had to reinstall it and all that.
Absolutely fine. So you're here now. So I'm not sure if you heard what Matt was saying, but could you just introduce yourself first of all to our listeners?
Yeah, so I'm a secondary English specialist. I've been in education for almost 20 years now, but I've done lots of different roles in there. So I've taught abroad, English as a foreign language, and in an early years setting. And for most of my career, I've been a secondary English specialist with particular interest in literacy. I've been a middle leader as well within secondary spaces. At the moment, I work in initial teacher training for Stockton Skit in the northeast, and I sort of went in that direction after a bit of a break and a bit of sort of reflection. I had a break because I had 2 young children and everything during the pandemic. So when I sort of returned to work, looking for a little bit more flexibility and having that interest in teacher development and teacher training, that's the direction that I went in. And my interest in Oracy sort of builds on that sort of English background, but my current role does include supporting and designing learning materials for trainee teachers that support them to effectively understand and teach Oracy.
So I'm not sure if you heard Matt talking about it, but what would Oracy mean to you?
Yeah, I just heard the sort of tail end of it. I mean, the new Oracy Commission has sort of defined Oracy, and I feel like their definition does give a broad scope of what Oracy is. So they talk about 3 sort of strands: articulating ideas, developing understanding, and engaging with others through speaking, listening, and communication. Interestingly, that builds upon what was already out there from Voice 21, I think, where they've actually added the listening and communication and put a little bit more emphasis on that. I think the listening part is important, but also communication is a little bit more inclusive because it also covers other forms of communication that are not just verbal. I think that, articulating ideas covers really important element of Oracy, which is the sort of social justice element, the idea of like building identity and belonging in society. I think that the developing understanding aspect is actually learning in itself. So in some ways, Oracy is something that underpins learning and thinking. And then the engaging with others is the social aspect of it. And I think probably since the COVID-19 pandemic, we sort of see that there's a greater need for that social development and something that was missing at that time.
So, I mean, really interesting stuff there from both of you. I'll just go back to you for a second, Matt. Can you just build on? You talked about Aristotelian ideas. I think that's how I say it. But what did you mean by that? Can you just clarify that a little bit more in terms of Oracy?
So what I think, and I'm seeing a lot of in Key Stage 3 curriculums, is that there is an understanding, and Gemma talked about articulacy, that it's all very well having a voice, but if you're not able to structure your thoughts, structure your arguments, so that your sentence has a beginning, middle, and an end when you're speaking, that you can have as much voice or airtime as possible, but people will stop listening to you. And what Gemma said about being people, wanting to be one of the strands being about being listened to and being heard. If you can't have those building blocks in place, then people won't listen to you and they will stop listening to you. So we're seeing that being developed an awful lot in Key Stage 3 curriculums, where students are listening, reading, watching speeches, and understanding that there is a structure behind Oracy, just in the same way as there's a structure behind composing a sentence or a literature essay or a history essay.
So, I mean, Matt, I know that you work at a multi-academy trust. So would you agree with Gemma that like distinctly since COVID, you've seen a particular decline in these areas?
I think COVID's been an accelerant for lots of different factors in education. So I think that's Gemma's absolutely right. I do think, and I'm be interested to see what Gemma thinks about this, but I think it probably goes back about 5 years before that when the new GCSEs came in and the scrapping of the speaking and the listening assessment at GCSE English language. That component used to be worth 20% of your final GCSE English language grade, and therefore that made a huge difference for an awful lot of children. Possibly, you could argue that it wasn't always accurately marked and things like that, but because it had such a high stake, had such a high value, it meant that English curriculum areas spent a lot of time preparing students for that particular skill.
Can you just touch on, just to go to that, Matt, before I bring in Gemma, what was the reasoning at that time to get rid of that particular piece of assessment?
Do you know what? I went back and deliberately checked to see what Michael Gove's reasoning for that. He basically said that at the time that the assessment lacked integrity. Ultimately, that was what his point, because it was an internal assessment that was marked internally by schools, and therefore he felt that it lacked integrity, and therefore it wasn't reliable, and that's why it was scrapped.
All right. So would you agree with that, Gemma, in terms of, like, even before COVID, it was getting rid of that assessment that's had a distinct effect on the importance of Oracy?
I think it's one element, certainly in our subject of English. I think it's broader than that across the curriculum, but certainly that sends a message. But I think that's in the broader context of accountability culture in schools and the focus on outcomes and, pulling away from the arts, pulling students out of those other subjects to do more maths, more English, more science, because those are the things that are measured. And there's a maybe we're coming towards a little bit more of a shift in terms of the philosophy of education and what is school and what is education for, and thinking beyond sort of that limited sort of range of things that count as important, and oftentimes that is GCSE grades. And I think it's obviously broader than that, as we all, well, teachers certainly probably think so, but in terms of the political landscape of education, I think what Matthew said there is it's to say that taking away the actual measure reduces the focus on Oracy is quite sad, isn't it? Because it tells us that we only focus on the things that are assessed. So yeah, that's certainly part of it. I would agree with you.
Yeah, I mean, we'll get onto the assessment part because a bit later, because it's been something I've been reading about. There seems to be a lot of debate about whether, assessment and Ofsted, and that's the way forward in terms of Oracy, and to get it back in the curriculum, it has to be assessed or it has to be part of Ofsted. And then a lot of debate saying, no, that shouldn't be. But just getting back to what you were saying, Gemma, about it being a big focus. I mean, I started with Keir Starmer's speech in July last year, where he really pushed this idea of Oracy as an important life skill, which is, I think, a worthwhile thing. But could you, after, like, we're not exactly, no, we're over a year. What am I talking about? So we're over a year. Would you say there's anything tangible that's happened from that, apart from getting people talking about Oracy?
I think it's interesting that he obviously said that as well before that change of government. And I think what it sort of signifies is perhaps now that government is in power, that there is potentially a shift in, like I said, the philosophy of education. A Labour government, it seems, would be more interested in things like improving democracy and having a more informed and engaged citizenry, boosting participation of marginalised groups, for example, increasing agency, traditionally associated with things like social mobility, and also to reconnect with what are typically Labour voters into that mainstream discourse. I think the other thing that was talked about is the job market. Having that ability to be sort of ready for life and work in a sort of global economy, and to succeed in that respect, not as individuals necessarily, but as a country for the economy. And I think there's a lot of research out there that talks about good language skills being crucial to social mobility, and I think that it sort of does make sense that a Labour government would have that as their philosophy in terms of that. I think the government, the present government, sort of has opened up like the ability to then, like, because we had the Oracy Commission that was formed before that change, but I think the findings from that report, this government may be more open to some of the suggestions that are in there, and it could be more of a marker of the potential for change in terms of the broader understanding of education.
Definitely. And I want to really sort of dig into that report as we go through, because, it seems really important, quite interesting in some of the things they've been saying, which doesn't, like, there is quite a lot of debate about aspects of it. But just getting back to you, Matt, would you say you see distinct evidence that students are declining in their Oracy skills, both since the change of assessment and COVID?
I think when Gemma also talked about how I think the schools have resisted the attempt to narrow curriculums, or certainly the schools that I have worked in have resisted the urge to narrow curriculums. But students and their parents can't help be affected by the mood music and be told that that we need more engineers, we need more scientists, we need more mathematicians, and all of those things are absolutely true. But it has come at the expense of students doing perhaps a broader range of subjects, perhaps subjects like drama, and actually the numbers for drama and performing arts in terms of GCSE entries have declined dramatically. So students are having less opportunities to follow lessons in which discussion and debate is a core principle or core learning skill in that particular subject. So inevitably, because the English curriculum no longer has this 20% assessment, and like Gemma said, you have seen students perhaps choosing a narrower curriculum. It's like any other skill. The less you practice it, the less skilled in it you become.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting idea. Just to get back to what you were saying in terms of other subjects, I guess one of the things maybe our listeners might be thinking is, well, this is all well and good. We've got two English teachers, talking about Oracy. That's, nice and straightforward. What does it mean for other subjects? So, I mean, a key thing is that idea that, like, well, Oracy isn't just for English. What does it look like? I guess for you, Gemma, just with your trainees, what does it look like for, well, let's go with non-humanity subjects. If I'm a maths teacher, say, let's go with maths. What would Oracy be for a maths teacher?
I think it's really interesting that there's this sort of misconception, really, that English is responsible for literacy, for Oracy, and for those kinds of things. But actually, the research shows that as well as languages and English, maths and science actually are the subjects that research shows benefit the most from Oracy, and that may be just where the research has been directed. But that there's that misconception that it's got nothing to do with some of those other subjects. I think maybe that comes from maybe an idea of, there's more, that there's more limitations on correct answers in those subjects. But I think there's other skills that are explored, such as reasoning, problem solving, and ultimately Oracy and language and talk and discussion helps thinking, it scaffolds thinking, and so it's absolutely important in those other subjects, and certainly that's something that we do talk about with our trainees. The other thing to mention is that it is disciplinary. So it looks different in different subjects, and in terms of what high quality talk looks like, that is different for other subjects. And also, another thing to say about subjects is, without, and thinking about teacher preparedness particularly, we do those direct sessions on Oracy, and it's sort of filtered through other sessions as well. But actually, to be able to be fully equipped to support speech and communication in students, the teacher of whatever subject it has to have a really well developed understanding and in-depth understanding of their subject. So we know at the level that we're working with teachers right at the beginning of their career. That's something that is right at the beginning of their development. They're novices, and so we know that supporting those trainee teachers to deepen their understanding of the content in their subject and pedagogy also helps them to become better teachers of Oracy. And when they go into schools and they're watching, experienced and expert teachers teaching, that is another place that they're, and probably more significant place that they are going to develop their ability to do that, because you need that deep knowledge. Just like I wouldn't be able to have an in-depth discussion with anyone and be a football pundit because I don't know that much about it. So is the same with depth of subject. And then also it's about the confidence of trainees at this stage, like daring to kind of open up discussion because their subject knowledge might not be quite there yet, where they're able to sort of delve a little bit deeper. So rather than just thinking about it as explicit sessions on Oracy, we also have to think about that broader understanding of that pedagogical content knowledge that they're developing.
So just moving on back to you, Matt. I know at your trust you have, is it right, you've got like Oracy champions?
So we have not quite that, but we have something called subject architects, and effectively that means when the secondary schools, the curriculum areas come together 5 times a year across the trust, and they're currently working on assessment models in year 7, but later in the year, yes, they are coming round to Oracy. And just like Gemma said, disciplinary Oracy, what Oracy looks like in science, there will be an awful lot of similarities between what it looks like in humanities, but there will also be discrete differences, and therefore by giving them that chance to work together in other schools across the trust, there will be that ability for them to work together to sort of plan that, what effective Oracy looks like in the classroom, which is often underpinned as well by really effective questioning as well, and because if we're talking about discussion and debate within a science classroom, then your hinge questionings or your probing questions have to be planned. And obviously, like Gemma said, for an experienced teacher, that's something that they just do by second nature. But obviously, with teachers very early on in their careers, that's something that they need to consciously craft and think about.
Would you be able to give any concrete examples, Matt? So what would Oracy, we're sort of moving through the subject, but if you're going into, say, like a biology class, what would you say is excellent Oracy that would be, shown in a biology class that you'd be going into?
Yeah, so I think if you're thinking about science in particular, I think we're often talking about hypothesizing and getting the students to respond to the, because they will be taught that, this process happens, and what happens if you leave this particular plant out in the sunshine for how long and whatever. But all of those kind of what if speculative questions, I think, are probably what I would regard as the building block of of, of science. But then later on in science, they do have questions on their science papers about morality and the ethics around particular scientific practices that we as a science um, now adopt. So there will be later on, as you move up through the curriculum, through the years, there would be those opportunities for students to consider the morals and the ethics, the pros and the cons the advantages, but also the dangers of those different practices that we all live by today when we consider about science and medicine in particular.
And how structured would you expect it to be? So one of the things I've been reading a lot about is like Oracy is extremely planned out, structured talk with very strong parameters. Would you agree with that, Matt, or would you say it can be a bit more free flowing? I guess it maybe depends on the confidence of the teacher.
Yeah, and I think and it's interesting we're talking about science, but as we know, in the country we have a real shortage and a dearth of science teachers, and often when we do have excellent science teachers, sometimes they can be teaching outside their specialism. So it's interesting what Gemma was saying about subject knowledge. Particularly in science, you can often find biologists having to teach chemistry and physics, for example. But to go back to your pertinent question, I think there are. I think it has to be, to a certain degree, really planned and considered if they're going to be effective questioning, to tease out from the students the deeper thinking that you want them to do. Because ultimately, like you said in your introduction, one of the one of the real drivers around Oracy at the moment is we want Oracy to help students think in order to then produce effective written outcomes. And ultimately, this is what they are assessed on. So looking at those key command words that they have in their GCSE science papers and using that language in the debates and in the discussions, has to be planned and considered. But I saw our head of science the other day. Just they were doing something about reactivity of metals in the periodic table, and he could see that the students in front of him were beginning to struggle with all those kind of things. So then he really started getting them to start putting their hands over their ears and to consider their earrings and to look at their sort of their chains around their neck and think about why that he had that ability to go off piste slightly and bring it real world examples. And I think that's where Oracy really brings learning to life a lot of the time, because if a teacher's really skilled and knowledgeable about their subject, he or she can then really begin to explode the subject by asking the students probing questions about real world examples, about things that they literally can touch and feel in front of them.
That's so interesting. What about yourself, Gemma? When you're talking, or let's say you're observing, PGCE students, people at the very start of their teaching career, what sort of things, if someone says, I'm going to really focus on Oracy, this is the focus of the lesson, you're coming in to observe it. With a teacher who's maybe not as experienced as the teachers that Matt's talking about, what would you expect to see or hope to see in a lesson?
I think it's sort of a difficult one to say, because we wouldn't necessarily say that we would have an Oracy focus when we observe teachers. In our first term, we're right at the beginning of, like you said, they're real novices, so they're focused on the basics at the moment. And it's interesting what Matt was saying about the difference between a novice there and like an expert teacher in terms of how much structure we would expect to see. We support the trainees with structures just because that gets them off the blocks, really, in terms of being able to facilitate those discussions, because they don't necessarily have the confidence to go off piste, as Matt was saying, in that way. And also the position that we're in terms of, like we've already discussed, Oracy in schools and COVID and student confidence and all of those different factors. We also can't assume that students already know how to conduct discussions, how to listen to each other, how to be in those spaces, and particularly in a disciplinary way in those subjects. So we talked quite a lot about how to teach the skills and to think about and unpick in their subjects what are the skills that you want to teach. And also we looked at structures about how to facilitate those discussions. And I think thinking about the sort of dialogic teaching aspect, it kind of it kind of quashes that argument where we have that sort of active student, passive teacher versus active teacher, passive student, and then everyone's bickering about which is the best. Actually, dialogic teaching is both. It's active student engagement and that constructive teacher intervention. So we teach them that it's very purposeful. So I think probably to answer the original question, what I would want to see if there was discussion going on in the room would be that it was well thought out in terms of planning. What do you want them to learn from this in terms of developing those communication skills, and also how have you scaffolded it so it doesn't kind of go wrong because something that can happen if the trainee, if the teacher is a novice. And I think if they're an expert, then those structures potentially can be more relaxed and things can be a little bit more organic. But that also takes a lot of skill that's sort of under the surface and a lot of tacit knowledge that maybe does have structure to it, but we just don't see it because it's not as obvious.
So thanks so much for the conversation for the first half an hour. We've flown through. It's been super interesting. We're just going to go to our first ad break, and then I'll be back to talk more Oracy with Matt and Gemma.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
Parentkind are a national charity representing parent views and voice and championing parental participation in education and school life. By fostering strong school-parent partnerships, we can boost student attendance, improve behaviour and enhance academic performance. When parents actively participate, students thrive. Join the movement that's reshaping education for the better. Visit parentkind.org to learn more about reaping the rewards of working in partnership with parents.
Are you ready to enhance your assessments in a world where AI is transforming education? Join Toddle for an exclusive event, Designing Assessments with AI, a live session tailored just for UK educators. Explore practical strategies to keep your assessments both effective and fair as AI continues to reshape education. Hear from experts Darren Coxon and Dale Bassett, who'll guide you through designing authentic assessments and navigating AI's biggest challenges. It's happening on December the 2nd from 4 to 6:30 p.m. Don't miss out on this opportunity to discover how you can adapt your assessment strategies for the future of education. Register for free at toddleapp.com/UKAI and secure your spot now.
Hey educators, ready to kickstart 2025 with world-class inspiration? Then don't miss Bet UK, happening January 22nd to 24th in London. Get fired up in our high-energy arena hosted by Laura McInerney with an incredible lineup. Hear from racing driver and inclusion advocate Nicholas Hamilton and the poetic power duo Michael Rosen and Christian Foley. Plus, don't miss the legendary Stephen Fry discuss the human approach to AI. Explore hundreds of hours of unmissable content, the latest edtech, and free CPD opportunities to supercharge your skills. All for free. So why wait? Head to betshow.com and book your ticket now. Let's make 2025 your best year yet.
Yes, we're back. So, the Bet UK, January. I will be there Wednesday afternoon. Hopefully, I'll see you there. Can't wait. So, bringing Matt and Gemma back in. So, I guess my next question, just Gemma, can you build on it? I mean, this is a term that comes up in all the readings on Oracy, and it's you mentioned it just before the ad break, which is dialogical activities. Could you just explain what is dialogical teaching or dialogical activities? Because it wasn't a term I've actually come across, although it seems to be somewhat essential to teaching. But could you give us a definition or tell us how it works?
I suppose, like in a nutshell, if you like, language. It's the idea that language supports thinking and gives structure to it, and so in that respect, it's a pedagogical concern. It's not just let's teach them pupils out the skills of oracy and how to debate and how to reason and all those things, but it's actually something that builds the brain, and that theoretical research that underpins that. I think, dialogue that facilitates learning, and all of that, the stuff around that, is supported by theorists and is supported by neuroscience. We talk a lot about Vygotsky, and I think a lot of people are familiar with, and actually some of our trainees were already familiar with, zone of proximal development and things like that. But we're thinking from this sort of sense of children's cognitive development requires them to engage in conversation with others and engage with others through spoken language. And so we think of development as a social process rather than just a biological process. And also, it's important to development of identity and self-worth and other things that are sort of beyond just the scope of what we typically think of as education in schools. And like I said before, the dialogic teaching approach is broad, because there's never, I think that sometimes conversations are very polarized in education, and it's all about this type of teaching is the best, not this type of teaching. But I think what I quite like about the dialogic approach is that it considers that it's both, both the teacher and the student are active in designing activities that are dialogical in nature, and that it's not sitting back and going, oh, let's just have a free-for-all conversation. But at the same time, we're also creating an environment where talk is valued and talk is welcomed, because that's important as well. Like thinking about, building curiosity and that joy and that love of learning. So it's still, I don't like to use the word control, but it's still the teacher's very purposeful in designing talk, but actually the students are very active in that as well. And it's also about that teacher-student dialogue. And we do the ITAP, the intensive training practice. We do a session on questioning, and that's kind of just happened, and the Oracy flowed really nicely and had lots of overlap between those. And they also, the trainees did dialogic teaching as part of their PGCE as well. So they've kind of deep dived on it, if you like.
So, I mean, one of the big things I then want to explore with both of you, Matt and Gemma, is sort of something that came up when you were just talking then, Gemma. If I'm a teacher and I'm listening to this conversation, I'm thinking, okay, what is the difference between oracy and good questioning? I think that some of the reading I've been doing, it's like that, a lot of people, but it's just good questioning by a different name. I'll start with you, Matt, and then I'll bring you in, Gemma. What would you say, Matt, to a teacher who's like, well, this is just good questioning by a different name?
I, I, yeah, I mean, I was fascinated by what Gemma was saying, and I think I would make two comments really on build upon what Gemma said. I think as a teacher, the most joyful moments of a teacher is where there's a discussion taking place and you see a student start to speak, and then mid-sentence you see, because they're thinking hard and communicating their thoughts, they have that eureka moment. There is this kind of like, you literally see their hand, everything light up in front of them. The light bulb literally goes off above their head and they make those connections. And I don't think you ever really quite see that when they're scripting their answer on a page. And then the second thing is, then I think because you have that environment set up within your classroom, is then the student who then asks you a question that you don't have an answer to right away. And you have to kind of like pause, and the students see you thinking and unpacking the different elements of that question, and see you really thinking hard, and then having to, and then communicate, and sometimes being absolutely honest and going, I'm not entirely sure, but I would perhaps suggest, or perhaps this might be that answer. So I understand why people might say, oh, well, just use the effective questioning grid and, work your way down the model and across the model till you get into the how could and all those kind of things, from your very closed questions to very opening questions. And that's undoubtedly part of it. But once you've moved past that into the environment that Gemma was so eloquently describing, I think that the process of learning becomes not just one way, but two way. And then actually students are actually listening to each other and they're getting very excited about the discussions that are taking place, and they're learning from each other as much as they are from the teacher.
But do you want to build on that at all, Gemma?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I agree with that. And I think, the questioning is a huge slice of the cake when it comes to oracy. But I suppose what sometimes isn't said when we learn about questioning, we focus on good questioning, we focus on, probing and challenge and all of that stuff. But do we actually consider, are we asking a question because we actually want to know what students think? And I think that's the broader sort of philosophy of education, rather than sort of how we think of that sort of technical processes of education. We're thinking about that formative feedback loop. We're thinking about, pushing thinking a little bit, but are we actually thinking like, I really want to know what that student thinks? Are we curious? And it goes back to what Matt said about that mutual learning, not just between students, but what can the teacher learn from the experiences that students bring, which are varied and multifaceted? And what can we learn, and how can we value those experiences that they bring to the classroom in terms of creating meaning?
So just building on that, what I've got in front of me is the Oracy framework from Oracy Cambridge and Voice 21. And it says that use the Oracy framework to understand the physical, linguistic, cognitive, and social and emotional skills that enable successful discussion. And it's got 4 aspects. It's got the physical, so the voice and the body language; the linguistic, which is the vocab, the language, and the rhetorical techniques; the cognitive, which is content, structure, clarifying, summarizing, self-regulation, and reasoning; and the social and emotional, which is working with others, listening and responding, confidence in speaking, and audience awareness. I mean, the question I want to ask is, that all looks amazing, but when I look at that, I might be very daunted, particularly, I guess, with you, Gemma, if I'm a beginning teacher. It's like, are those the 4 aspects? I mean, do I have to do all those in a lesson? If I'm thinking about oracy, I'm getting them to talk right, but they're showing body language, showing reasoning, and then I've got the social emotional. They've got to be aware of their audience. I mean, I guess, like anything in teaching, you might be looking at that, this all looks great, but it's a lot. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. We actually looked at the framework in session 1, because we had a split session on oracy, so a morning session in earlier, I think around the end of September, and then one last week. And we looked at the framework, and because we were looking at dialogic teaching and the sort of pedagogical stuff later, and we were also looking at learning about talk, we didn't focus on the cognitive and social and emotional, but we looked at the physical and linguistic. And all we really did was unpick what some of the terms mean, because do they understand what we mean by projection, and where that's relevant and where it's not relevant, and do we understand what we mean by those non-verbal elements of communication? But also in the linguistic, there's things like register, there's things like rhetoric, and we unpicked a little bit of what those terms mean, because they might not even know outside of an English specialism, particularly, or other specialisms that look at those kinds of terminology. And I like to do it as a sort of, it's not just like, let's go through this and I'll tell you what they are, but we have some open discussion about those. We looked at how reasonable adjustments for SEND and things like that when we're thinking about facial expressions, eye contact, for example. So I think it was nice to open up the discussion, but when we sort of did some retrieval practice on it, they couldn't remember some of those features of talk. So there's so much, like it's an ongoing thing that they then need to revise almost and practice, because it's just the same as their subject content knowledge. Like, it's something that's always developing, and we certainly just scratched the surface at that point. I definitely would, and the message to trainees as well is that we wouldn't make it seem like it's a checklist, and we would really emphasize that it's not a checklist, and we're not expecting you to put all of this stuff in your lessons. And I don't really like that idea of, if we have something, and particularly if it's called a framework, sometimes that's interpreted as, we've got to get all this stuff in, but actually getting them to think about, and we've got a range of subjects and we're quite a small skit, so think we have about 27 secondary trainees of all different subjects. So it's difficult in that moment to have those conversations. But we thought about the different kinds of subjects, so the more practical subjects and the sort of humanities subjects, like you talked about earlier. And we really unpicked the similarities and differences in terms of the disciplinary literacy in those and the disciplinary oracy, in those subjects, and thought about, what are the most important things on those lists in our subjects, and what things do we actually need to explicitly teach. So they were able to be a bit more selective in that respect and think about the priorities for their subject, and also for phase, because they do have oracy sessions in primary as well.
Yeah, that's so interesting. What about yourself, Matt? You talked about your subject architects. So when you talk to them about when they're looking at oracy, what exactly are they looking at? Do they have a framework? What does that mean for your subject architects?
Yeah, so when we come round to that, we do have a very good Oracy framework in a couple of our schools, and they are sort of like really explicit strategies that are effectively taught as skills to the students through their sort of journey. So, and you'll find these, you'll I'll be honest with you that the driving subject behind that is English, but we talk about various different kinds of speaking skills that we find in the classroom. So we talk about things like turn and talk. We talk about um, talk tactics. We talk about that ability to summarize. We talk about that ability to instigate and to probe, to challenge and to clarify. So these are specific um, Oracy skills that are built and weaved into our English curriculum and schemes of learning. So we are explicitly teaching those students the different skills when they pop up within the learning curriculum. And the idea is that these will then be weaved out across to different curriculums to use when it's appropriate. They're not, as like Gemma was saying, absolutely, they're not a checklist, and it doesn't matter that, if you don't, if you only see one of those in a lesson or two of them in a lesson, it's not something that you would mark a student down on.
Mm.
Mm.
Would those skills be sort of exactly like what we were just discussing, like physical, linguistic, cognitive? Like what sort of skills would you sort of be looking for, Matt?
Yeah, and I was listening with real interest to what you were saying there, because I don't think actually at the moment, I don't think we have the physical built into it. I think we the physical is definitely not made explicit at the moment anyway. And I'm just literally looking at the icons that would appear on classroom walls, and they appear not to be present. So I think there's some work there for us to develop around that. I think that's absolutely fascinating. I, I was lucky enough to go to a very prestigious private independent school a couple of months ago for a charity function in which the students were thanking local charities for letting them do some kind of work experience. And these were all lower six students. So these are all year 12 students. They're all 16, 17-year-olds. And they were talking about the work they had been doing on these outreach programs. And I was stunned by how impressive their physical attributes around their Oracy were. So their ability to use volume, pace, fluency, pause, eye contact, all of those all without notes as well, by the way. Not a single flashcard in sight. There were no stumbles, there were no fumbles. And it wasn't so much what they said, that old adage of they could have literally read the telephone book. I think possibly most of these kids probably could have read the telephone book, but the audience would still be listening to them. And I couldn't help but be deeply impressed, but also at the same time deeply saddened, because I know I have students who are just as academically able within my own settings, who just haven't had the ability, who just haven't had the experiences to develop those skills in a similar kind of way.
I just want to pick up on that because that is something that comes a lot in the reading. that state schools can need to, in a way, catch up with private schools. They can be as good. That this is something that has been quite distinct in private schools for a long time. That their oracy, part of this idea about life skills and making sure all students are confident speakers, because this is one of the disadvantages of certain schools, and that's something those who have a private education are stronger on. And I'm just wondering, I guess, why is that? One, I guess, from what you're saying, Matt, in terms of actually agreeing with it. But I'll start with you, Gemma. What do you think has been the issue in this sort of almost state school, private school gap, if you think it exists as well?
Yeah, it's difficult to say, having not worked in an independent school before, but I would probably guess that it's centred as more important, maybe. I think socially that it's seen as, maybe it's more normalised that we do those kinds of performative talk. Having said that, over the years of teaching, when I think of the times that I've had that sting behind the eyes and that real proud moment, it's when students have done those kinds of performative speeches and things like that. And I had the privilege of going to the Oracy exhibition last month, where there were students from state schools and from schools in also deprived areas. They had some students that were sort of facilitating. They were I don't know, like the MC, I guess, of the conference itself, who were just amazing. But then there was one section where we just had the absolute privilege of just listening to speeches that were done by students, and it was the same thing, where this ability to sort of articulate themselves and those physical features, as well as the linguistic ones, were there. And it was just so enjoyable to watch. The night before the conference as well, there was a session that was on from Poetry by Heart, and they also brought some students in to perform poetry out loud. And these were quite young students, actually, I think primary students. And I was just so amazed and impressed, and probably a little bit teary-eyed by how just wonderful it was to watch them. And I feel like this comes into what parents want as well. I think parents want to see that kind of confidence in their students and those kinds of social skills. And I think, I've got really young children. My daughter's only in year one. She's just turned 6. But, even when we first started going to the parents' evenings in primary, the first questions that I was asking is, how is she socially? Is she engaging with other students? Is she talking? And that's what I think parents care about. And that performative talk is really impressive, isn't it? And I think, we definitely need more of that in state schools. But I don't think that, certainly, I think probably children, particularly in deprived areas, are somewhat disadvantaged in terms of maybe things like vocabulary, and sort of those kinds of limitations. But it is possible, and I've seen it recently, for students to be just as impressive in the state sector. So definitely needs more of it.
That's super interesting, because I know, just getting back to you, Matt, that the trust that you work in is extremely varied in terms of socioeconomics and the difference in schools and the difference in students. I mean, how do you ensure, or how are you looking at Oracy across the trust? Would you say that it's almost more important as a focus in the schools that are maybe slightly more deprived than some of your main schools in the trust?
It's difficult to say with any sort of real kind of authority on that, because all the different schools are in various different stages of their journey and their growth. But 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 going back to what Gemma said, you know, I do agree with her in that there were even greater challenges for those communities where there is deprivation and that kind of thing, because there's probably less modeling in professional environments going on, as well as that lack of vocabulary and things like that. So that, if you live and teach in leafy southwest Surrey, like I'm fortunate enough to do, then you have a lot of people commuting to and from London. You have lots of businesses set up to and from London, and therefore all those professionals and who for whom that Oracy skills is such a vital part of their connections and communications with their customers, their clients, and their competitors. So they probably receive even more modeling and implicit uh, um, exposure to those skills. So yes, I think it's raising all boats. That whole sort of kind of adage is probably even more important because, and this sounds, if we take it back to the whole kind of measured and debate that often the press like to do in the summer about the number of children from state schools that have made it into Oxford or Cambridge, for example. Ultimately, the vast majority of children that make it to Oxford or Cambridge who get a place have an oral interview before they are offered a place. So if we do truly believe in social justice and social mobility, then there is an imperative to ensure that children from all over the country, regardless of their start, have those Oracy skills that they are on a level playing field with competitors who might have other advantages.
Yeah, I mean, I think it just occurs to me, how much we sort of rely on Oracy. Yeah, exactly. In terms of job interviews, obviously, there's a big push and there's a lot of competition for apprenticeships or degree apprenticeships. And degree apprenticeships are, you know, I teach at a sixth form, and I know this, us almost solely based on the ability of the students to articulate themselves and do job interviews, and they're incredibly competitive for the top firms. You write about Oxbridge and what they're looking for. Ultimately, the end, obviously, there's a long process, but at the end of the day, it's how they can articulate themselves. And then in job interviews, and it just seems so crucial. So I guess one of the things is, I mean, you were talking about Michael Gove and some of the changes. It's sort of like, why did this drift out in terms of its importance in the curriculum, despite how important it is? And why has it sort of re-emerged now? Is it just the Labour government looking at it? It just seems a peculiar aspect that this thing that is so crucial to social justice and success, it seems to have faded out and now it's back in. I mean, what are your thoughts, Gemma?
I suppose one of the things that we haven't addressed is perhaps the philosophy on sort of behaviour and the structures around that. And whilst I'm not against, well-structured behaviour policies and having, I don't really like the term sort of zero tolerance, but sometimes there's a need for more rigid behaviour structures. But I think within that system, sometimes because we're reliant on sort of control as a measure of behaviour rather than learning how to be a person and how to operate within a formal environment like a school, I think that sometimes what we're then doing is almost masking the problem. And in my previous school, it was in a really tough area. And I think I experienced an interesting sort of shift in that the behaviour policy was very well sort of structured and I suppose what people would call strict, but in terms of it, there was a sort of whole school approach to behaviour, and then but what was interesting was that later on that was relaxed, and when it was relaxed, chaos ensued. And I suppose what some people might say to that, if you were a proponent of those structures, would be that's why we need those structures. But actually, I think for me, what it showed was that underneath it all, we weren't actually teaching the students how to, be self-aware and to regulate emotions and all those other things through that behaviour policy. So I think alongside those kinds of structures, if schools choose to have a rigid sort of behaviour policy, we also have to be aware that we also need to teach those skills, because eventually they're going to leave school and then they're out into the world. And if they don't know how to operate in a formal environment, like what becomes of them in that respect? So I think sometimes that sort of control element of behaviour management limits And certainly for our trainees, when we talk about Oracy and like collaborative work and things, they're a little bit scared of letting go of that control, because particularly early in their career, behavior is the scariest thing, and it's the place where things can go wrong, and it's emotionally charged and that kind of thing. And so doing something that's a little bit more free flowing or involving more talk and sort of letting go of that sort of control element is a little bit scary. They see it as a bit risky.
Yeah.
And I think that in some ways that pervasive sort of approach to behavior sometimes makes people feel a little bit reluctant to let go of that control in general, because we become sort of reliant on it, and then we sort of worry about, oh well, and it's not just behavior but also routines and things that are structured in terms of lesson plans and things and pace of lessons, and having to get through all of these little sections of parts of lessons, and it being a little bit more prescriptive sometimes makes people not want to let go of the reins. And I think perhaps that culture and that philosophy in terms of behavior and structure can sort of put the oracy on the back burner a little bit, even if it's subconscious.
Yeah, that's such an interesting point. So I'm going to go to our next break. We're going to head to the news, and I'll come back with Matt and Gemma. So much to think about there, and we'll come back for our last half an hour.
Parentkind are a national charity representing parent views and voice and championing parental participation in education and school life. By fostering strong school-parent partnerships, we can boost student attendance, improve behaviour, and enhance academic performance. When parents actively participate, students thrive. Join the movement that's reshaping education for the better. Visit parentkind.org to learn more about reaping the rewards of working in partnership with parents.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
Hey educators, ready to kickstart 2025 with world-class inspiration? Then don't miss Bet UK, happening January 22nd to 24th in London. Get fired up in our high-energy arena hosted by Laura McInerney, with an incredible lineup. Hear from racing driver and inclusion advocate Nicholas Hamilton, and the poetic power duo Michael Rosen and Christian Foley. Plus, don't miss the legendary Stephen Fry discuss the human approach to AI. Explore hundreds of hours of unmissable content, the latest edtech, and free CPD opportunities to supercharge your skills. All for free, so why wait? Head to betshow.com and book your ticket now. Let's make 2025 your best year yet.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
The BBC Norfolk news website focuses on the national issue of school attendance. The report states that persistent absence from schools is higher in Norfolk than the national average. At secondary school level, the Norfolk total is at 38.1%, compared to the national average of 28.3%. And for primary schools, it is 18.9%, compared to 17.2%. The BBC sat in on hearings at magistrates' courts to hear the human stories behind the national issue. One parent told magistrates she was frightened of her son and had no control over him, whilst another said issues with the child using school toilets had led to school refusal. One family explained that their own ill health had affected their ability to take primary-age pupils to school, and restrictive shift patterns at work had made it even more difficult. Representatives from the local authority made comments after the hearings, reminding of the importance of ensuring a child's attendance to school, and it's as high as possible, as many times as possible. It pointed to government guidance which schools must follow to ensure regular attendance, with a focus on support to remove barriers to attendance overall. According to the TES magazine, private schools lose their GCSE results edge after adjustments for students' backgrounds. Researchers say state school students perform better in English, maths and science, but private schools still perform better in creative arts subjects. Researchers from UCL say the findings could have implications for parents deciding on the best education for their child, and raise questions about the relative strength of creative education in state schools. The analysis is based on GCSE results from state and independent schools from the 2016 to 17 cohort. The data from the UK Millennium Cohort study follows the lives of 19,000 young people born across all 4 home nations in 2000 to 2002. Before adjusting, private school students achieved 4/5 of a grade higher across all GCSE subjects, assuming 8 were studied. Once socioeconomic status was accounted for, the researchers said this difference was statistically indistinguishable from 0. But when just the core subjects were considered, state schools had the edge, achieving on average 2/3 of a grade higher in maths, 2/5 of a grade higher in science, and a slight advantage in English after all of the adjustments. Professor Jake Anders said it has been long assumed that the private sector outperforms the state, and that over the past 2 decades, state schools have increased their focus on core subjects. Full details can be found in the TES magazine online. Schools Week covers a story on school leader stress after Education Support released its annual Teacher Wellbeing Index. Although it reported that the overall well-being score of teachers and leaders had improved slightly, Chief Executive Sinead McBratey warned disturbingly high rates of stress, anxiety and burnout continue to affect staff, exacerbated by pupil and parent behaviours and a lack of support outside of school for children and young people. The article lists 7 issues, with 78% of teachers reported as being stressed, although there was a drop from 39% to 35% in staff reporting a mental health issue. On a positive note, the proportion of staff who said they considered their organisation's culture had a negative effect on their well-being fell from 55% to 50%, and 27% of staff now experience a culture which is positive for their well-being, up from 22% last year. Full details can be found in Schools Week on their online article. The Guardian covers claims that schools and colleges in England are failing in their legal duty to prevent and address racism. Campaigners are calling for the national curriculum in England to include an explicit anti-racism focus, with Black history as a compulsory subject. In a letter to the Prime Minister, a group of leaders from several organisations have warned that racism is holding all young people back, and calls for urgent action to address the impacts of a growing crisis. The letter goes on to say that the planned review of the national curriculum offers a perfect opportunity to embed diverse, anti-racist content. Recommendations in the letter include ensuring a whole school approach to tackling racism be implemented, the DFE to treat racism as a safeguarding issue, and for anti-racism guidance to be published for all schools and colleges. The organisations signing up to the letter include the Diana Award, Everyday Racism, and the African Caribbean Education Network, among others. A Department for Education spokesperson said, "Racism and discrimination have absolutely no place in our schools, and we have launched an independent curriculum and assessment review aimed at delivering a curriculum that reflects the diversities of our society." Finally, several parts of the UK were affected by the weather in recent days. More than 100 schools across the Scottish Highlands, 30 in North Wales, and almost 200 in Devon and Cornwall shut due to snow. Many schools affected, however, were able to continue teaching pupils, as online learning, developed during the pandemic, was activated for the majority of pupils. This has been your Teachers Talk Radio News with Joe Fox.
Cool. Thanks so much, Joe. So we're back with Matt and Gemma for the final part of our show. don't have huge amounts of time. This conversation has just flown by. It's been really, really insightful. So I'm going to just hit you sort of with a lot of questions now. I mean, one of the things I've been reading is from Alex Quigley. He's obviously very well known for his work on literacy and closing vocab gaps. And one of his concerns with Oracy, and I guess it comes back to what you were saying, Matt, in terms of the students you saw at that private school. And he was saying, how do we avoid mistaking extroversion for excellence when we focus on oracy and communication? So I guess the thing would be, you can present brilliantly, but we don't want, I guess his argument was, you don't want to produce a whole heap of blustering, almost like politician type talkers who are brilliant at talking but say nothing. I mean, what would your thoughts be on that, Matt? How do you avoid that?
Can't think of who he's possibly thinking of.
I was going to say what you actually named, but I will avoid that.
I do generally think that's a real thing. When I was thinking about this, I was thinking, about our Key Stage 3 curriculum around rhetoric and things like that, and I was trying to think about, well, who in contemporary society would I actually want to listen to? What politician, what national figure, what speeches do we use that are contemporary that we would actually do? I think probably that in terms of curriculum wise, probably Obama is probably the last person that we would probably use, and we're talking about somebody that's a decade old. So I do think that's a real concern, but I also do think that actually in society we're seeing that skill of oracy disappearing as opposed to the tweet or the meme.
What are your thoughts, Gemma?
Yeah, I think I agree with that sometimes the performative elements of speech or of oracy are the sort of the things that we think about the most, and debating's always seems to be on there, and that's a very sort of structured performative form of talk. It's very high stakes. It's all about rhetoric. It's not actually about dialogue, which is really important, particularly in such a polar, social media is awful, isn't it? It's full of this just argumentative just discussion. So actually, other kinds of dialogue where we're actually listening to each other and critiquing and taking on board other people's ideas, those things are just as important, if not more important, than those performative forms of talk. And if we think about everyday life, it's quite rare that we go on stage and give a speech, although it is a really nice skill to have, and certainly from a social justice lens, certainly like students should have the opportunity to develop that. But it's a very small slice of the cake in terms of what oracy is, I think.
That's so interesting. So carrying that on with some of the other issues that I've read about, the idea I've also seen from some concerns is that oracy is just another means for teachers to compensate for society. So this comes back to the idea that since COVID, there's been a rise in issues, and that now, teachers are almost being asked to be speech and language therapists, and that compensating for issues that are wider in society. And so, oracy is just another form of that. I mean, what are your thoughts on that, Gemma? And then I'll bring you in, Matt.
Yeah, I think maybe, again, that sort of that focus on teaching oracy skills, but not thinking about oracy as underpinning learning and as a core element, rather than sort of a bolt-on thing that we've got to teach these skills. But actually, oracy facilitates learning and thinking. I today have just been doing that myself because I've got a particular area that I'm looking at for my role, and I got in touch with somebody that I know from my network who's an expert on that, and I went and had coffee with her, and having that conversation helped me to sort of structure my thoughts and ideas and listen to her points of view and her expertise, and then I came away with so much more clarity and understanding on those matters. So we do that ourselves as a form of learning, and I think the report does talk about learning through talk, and there's a huge section on that, and also learning about talk, and I think sometimes we focus maybe on just oracy is teaching skills about how to talk, but it's a lot more than that, and I think it's core to learning and thinking.
Yeah. What about you, Matt? If a teacher's like, oh, another thing in the curriculum. Now I have to teach speech. This is all coming. We're expected to do so much as teachers. It's just another thing being added on where we're having to basically, that idea we're compensating for problems that are wider in society coming out of COVID, and it's just adding on to workload, and it's just too much for teachers. What would your thoughts on that be?
I mean, I would go back to what Gemma says, what Gemma brilliantly articulated, that Oracy is about the thought processes behind that, and explaining your thinking and your learning. And the more articulate students will become, the more effective learners they will become in any subject. I mean, undoubtedly, I think pretty much any primary colleague that's listening to this chat would probably say that there has been a dramatic shift and decline in that. And I do know that the Labour government are looking to see whether they can fully restore the Sure Start programme that was scrapped in 2010, but it will cost tens of billions to bring that back. So, when Gemma was talking about her her child in year one having those, she wanted to know that her child was communicating and interacting with others. You know, the probably, you know, the teacher of Gemma's child is probably absolutely delighted to have Gemma's child in her class, because Gemma's child will be so articulate and all those kind of things. Whereas there may well be other children in that room who at year one might still be non-verbal.
Mm. Yeah, it's an interesting thing. I mean, I don't know if any of you saw, I think you pronounce his name Esner, Mark Esner's article in the TES. Now, he was it's just this October, he was quite positive about Oracy. I mean, I don't want to sort of say, oh, he wasn't, but he also said that, Oracy risks being the next big thing. And I've got that in inverted commas. And although he was optimistic, he was concerned. I mean, it's obviously come about because of Starmer's speech. There's a lot on it. There's a big push. But how do we avoid it just becoming seen as just another, fad in teaching that's soon to be forgotten, the next big thing? What are your thoughts, Gemma?
I think it is very important not to see it as a bolt-on, and I think sometimes that happens with things that come in and out of education because somebody's responsible for it, and then somebody goes, right, let's just have a little framework and let's just give that to all the teachers, and they've got to use it every time they talk, and things like that. I think, though, also that this is not just a UK but an actual global trend towards developing these skills. So the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development talk about oracy and in the sense of, this is not using that terminology exactly, but language and communication. Things like, the rise of AI. That sounds quite ominous, but soft skills of communication are much more important now, because actually our unique selling point is that we're a human being, because those AI systems are very clever and they can do a lot of things. And what's kind of left for us to do is the human bit, and that's becoming more important in some respects globally. So I think that we've talked a lot about it being a current sort of government thing, but I think it is something that's sort of spread across globally.
That's so interesting. What are your thoughts on that, Matt?
I think there's a couple of other just things to add to that. I think we've been working in our trust schools with a neuroscientist called TJ Power, and he teaches the students about the chemical elements in their brain and how they affect their moods and things like that. And he explains to them that the chemical connection, which is oxytocin, there is no discernible boost when you send somebody a text message, a WhatsApp, a Snap, or an Insta. But when you communicate directly to somebody, you get a positive boost in your oxytocin levels. So, just listening to the news thing about attendance in Norfolk, it one of the drivers to get students into schools, if we have more of those connections, those human connections, like Gemma was just saying, that will have a positive boost in lots of other areas. And I suppose the final thing I'd just like to say is I really hope, although I'm not hopeful, that out of this curriculum review that's going on, that there will effectively be a long-term strategy, that a government kind of is brave enough to step back and say, we almost need to depoliticize education. We need to see what's really, really effective, what really works, what is best practice, and then just put that in place for 10, 15 years and just let schools and school leaders get on with it. And, and the next education secretary not take us in another direction, and we have to tack again, because it does feel like that criticism that will come from people is because just simply of the number of educational secretaries we've had and the constant jacking in directions that we've had from that.
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant point. I was just thinking of how nice that would be and whether that's even possible, but I mean, that would be amazing. So I'm just going to go to our final ad break. And when we come back for the very last part, I'd really like to think about, Ofsted and assessment and whether it's possible.
Parentkind are a national...
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
Parentkind are a national charity representing parent views and voice and championing parental participation in education and school life. By fostering strong school-parent partnerships, we can boost student attendance, improve behaviour and enhance academic performance. When parents actively participate, students thrive. Join the movement that's reshaping education for the better. Visit parentkind.org to learn more about reaping the rewards of working in partnership with parents.
Are you ready to enhance your assessments in a world where AI is transforming education? Join Toddle for an exclusive event, Designing Assessments with AI, a live session tailored just for UK educators. Explore practical strategies to keep your assessments both effective and fair as AI continues to reshape education. Hear from experts Darren Coxon and Dale Bassett, who'll guide you through designing authentic assessments and navigating AI's biggest challenges. It's happening on December the 2nd from 4 to 6:30 p.m. Don't miss out on this opportunity to discover how you can adapt your assessment strategies for the future of education. Register for free at toddleapp.com/UKAI and secure your spot now.
Hey educators, ready to kickstart 2025 with world-class inspiration? Then don't miss Bet UK, happening January 22nd to 24th in London. Get fired up in our high-energy arena hosted by Laura McInerney, with an incredible lineup. Hear from racing driver and inclusion advocate Nicholas Hamilton and the poetic power duo Michael Rosen and Christian Foley. Plus, don't miss the legendary Stephen Fry discuss the human approach to AI. Explore hundreds of hours of unmissable content, the latest edtech, and free CPD opportunities to supercharge your skills. All for free. So why wait? Head to betshow.com and book your ticket now. Let's make 2025 your best year yet.
And we're back. So where I want to end, we haven't got a huge amount of time. The conversation has just been so interesting, and we're sort of almost at the end of it, is the idea about assessment and Ofsted. So in all the stuff I've been reading, there's a lot of debate. Some are saying, no, Oracy can't be part of Ofsted. You shouldn't have, almost like a tick list. But in the Oracy Education Commission, they are very big on, well, if you want to have it as part of, the curriculum, if we want to make it important, it does need to be part of the new Ofsted framework. And I was talking about the new Ofsted dashboard idea, and that it should be in there as a form of something that inspectors can actually see, and that's the only way you're going to give it some the importance it deserves. But there's a lot of pushback on that as well. I mean, I'll start with you, Gemma. What are your thoughts?
I think if we're being realistic, if we want people to take it seriously and really, think about it, how they can introduce it as part of the core element of teaching and learning in their schools, Ofsted does play a big part in that, and we know that does inform priorities. I think the debate comes into sort of how it shows up, and maybe was something that we haven't talked about, that there's sort of a worry that if we look at things like the variety of kinds of talk, what is the sort of pervasive rhetoric on that? Is oracy going to be then policed? Is it going to be about standardized forms of English and those kinds of things? And what does it look like is probably quite important, because what it looks like, it will be the things that are focused on.
What are your thoughts, Matt?
I mean, I agree with Gemma in terms of Ofsted being a key driver. That is a simple reality. I would really hope that Ofsted would listen to the experts in the field and not make the mistake as they have done with perhaps the Key Stage 3, Key Stage 4 debate, which is decide that the Ofsted model is the right model, and therefore just recognise and celebrate outstanding practice rather than being prescriptive around it.
So I guess my next one, leading straight into that, would be assessment. So the other idea is that one of the reasons why Oracy isn't given the place it deserves is because, unlike written work, there's no means of assessing it at this stage. So, starting with you again, Gemma, would you agree with that? Does there need to be some sort of Oracy assessment for it to get the place in the curriculum it deserves?
In some ways, again, being sort of realistic, yes, because again, sometimes the drivers and measures of schools come from like their outcomes, and if there's no tangible outcome, again, that will sometimes make people think it's not necessarily the priority, because schools are judged on their outcomes. And so realistically, yes. Is that necessarily the right thing? Maybe not. Maybe it shouldn't be, but unfortunately that's where we are. That's the world that we live in, and I think probably that would push Oracy to the forefront, maybe for the wrong reasons, but does it matter if it's for the wrong reasons if we get it in there?
And what are your thoughts, Matt?
I mean, we currently do have in English this third qualification, the spoken language assessment, which has a pass merit distinction. I'm going to speak on behalf of my students here, so I'm conscious that I might be putting words into their mouth, but I don't think they put any massive intrinsic value on that. It's not something that they're going to put on their CV that they got distinction on that. So if we are going to have we do have an assessment, but it's not valued. So if we are going to have an assessment, it has to have something that has stakes and value to it. Otherwise, we'll just have the same model that we currently have, which is effectively just something that's bolted on and has to be done in order that students can actually get their GCSE English language qualification.
I suppose the other thing to say is are we just talking about in English? Because could there be an oral assessment component to any of the subjects? Because actually that could, broaden the sort of, equity, if you like, because some students might be better at that than they are at the written element of things.
So interesting. So we're almost at an end. So I'm going to give you each a round. It's going to have to be about 30 seconds just for some final thoughts. I'll start with you, Gemma.
Final thoughts. It's hard to sort of bring it all into. I think the final thought for me is that Oracy is complex, and I don't think it can be a bolt-on. I don't think that, for 1 minute, that even though we've done 2 sessions on it, which might be more than some other teacher training providers, that's enough and that ticks the box and that's it. I think it's incredibly complex. I think it's core, and I think it's an ongoing developmental thing for teachers and students.
Matt?
And I would just echo what Gemma has just said, and I would just add the fact that my child he's now in lower 6, and so therefore 17. His Oracy skills at A level have come on massively. So what's going right at Key Stage 5? I would argue perhaps we need to have a look at Key Stage 3 and 4.
Yeah, that's as a Key Stage 5 teacher. Yeah, that's really interested me, because I'll just end with this thing. It was just interested me today that I actually had a criticism for a student who said there's too much Oracy in Dave's classes. We talk too much about things, and then he gives us too much written homework because he never gets through it, and then we have to do the written stuff. And I was like, yeah, that's the point. That's what we love about it. But it's it's horses for courses, isn't it? So I'll end on that thought. Thank you so much, Matt and Gemma, for an absolutely fascinating conversation on Oracy. I really enjoyed it. It's taught me a lot. Thanks so much for giving up your time on a Friday night to come on and talk about it.
Thank you. And thanks, Matt, for all your nice words. I feel like because I was going first, I was getting all the compliments about, oh, that was really good and things like that. But yeah, it's really interesting things from both ends there.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, guys. Thanks to all our listeners. That's my last show of the year. I'll be back at the end of January. Thanks so much for listening to all of my shows since I started this year. I really appreciate it. Have a great Christmas to everybody out there. Have a great Christmas, Matt and Gemma, and thank you so much. And that is tonight's show.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.